We've all seen movies where a dead person suddenly wakes up at their own funeral or in the morgue. But did you know that this can happen in real life too? In this episode, I'll tell you about people who regained consciousness during their own funerals. Several years ago, a 34-year-old man named Brighton Dama was declared dead by doctors. They said he died from a long-lasting illness. But when people gathered around his coffin to say their final goodbyes, they noticed that Brighton was moving. The mourners panicked and ran, thinking he had risen from the dead like a zombie. When they calmed down, they realized the doctors were wrong. His relatives rushed him back to the hospital where he was put on life support. Amazingly, just 2 days later, he was discharged and sent home. A 49-year-old woman named Fogilya Mukhametzyanova became known around the world after she woke up at her own funeral. Doctors had mistakenly pronounced her dead, and her family prepared the ceremony. On the day of the funeral, mourners gathered around her coffin. Suddenly, she woke up and began screaming. She was taken back to the hospital, but the joy didn't last long. The shock was too much. Her heart stopped again just 12 minutes later. Her family blamed the doctors, saying she might still be alive if not for their mistake. In Ethiopia, a man named Herf Nehero had been seriously ill. His death didn't surprise his family or the doctors. But during the funeral, after loved ones had already said their goodbyes, a knocking sound suddenly came from inside the coffin. Some guests ran, while the bravest opened the lid and saved the man. He had woken up hours earlier but was too weak to call for help. Experts later said he had likely been in a coma that doctors failed to diagnose. Sadly, 2 months later, he passed away for real. A 55-year-old shepherd named Malik from India was once found unconscious. His relatives thought he had died and prepared a funeral. During the ceremony, one of the guests noticed Malik slightly moving his head. The funeral was stopped immediately, and he was taken to the hospital. Doctors discovered that he had suffered from a severe fever, which made him lose consciousness and appear dead. In China, a 95-year-old woman named Xiufen climbed out of an unsealed coffin 6 days after being declared dead. Her family thought she had died from a head injury, but the coffin hadn't been nailed shut yet. A day before the funeral, her relatives found the coffin empty, and Li sitting in the kitchen, cooking food. Doctors later said she had experienced a state of suspended animation. The case of Lyudmila Steblevskaya from Russia is unique. She frightened everyone by coming back from the dead twice. In 2011, she was hospitalized in Tomsk after feeling unwell. A few days later, her daughter Anastasia called the hospital to ask about her mother, and doctors told her that Lyudmila had died. Heartbroken, Anastasia started planning the funeral and notifying relatives. But when she went to the morgue to claim the body, she saw her mother calling her by name. Lyudmila had survived 3 full days in the cold morgue. In 2012, she was hospitalized again. Doctors once more declared her dead, and once more they were wrong. She regained consciousness just a few hours later. Tony Yahle, a mechanic from Ohio, was admitted to the hospital on August 4, 2013. He was stable for several hours until his heart suddenly stopped beating late that evening. Refusing to accept it, Tony's 17-year-old son Lawrence ran into the room and shouted, "Dad, you're not dying today!" Moments later, Tony's heart began beating again. Doctors immediately continued resuscitation. Within minutes, Tony had fully come back to life. He was examined for several days and was soon able to return home. In 2007, a man from Venezuela named Carlos Camillo narrowly escaped death after a serious car accident. Doctors arriving at the scene believed he had died from his injuries. Pathologists were about to begin the autopsy when Carlos suddenly moved, opened his eyes, and even tried to sit up. He had been unconscious the entire time. Fortunately, he recovered quickly. He still keeps his own death certificate and proudly shows it to journalists. A 60-year-old woman named Miss Alice spent 3 hours wrapped in a plastic bag inside a morgue refrigeration chamber. Doctors mistakenly believed she had died from a lung infection. Her daughter came to say goodbye one last time and felt that her mother was still breathing. Miss Alice was immediately taken out of the morgue and put on life support in the intensive care unit. A 66-year-old man from China named Jian Dayan was quite an unusual person. One day, he decided to hold his own funeral just to see how many people would come. In Chinese culture, people regularly visit their ancestors' graves, believing the dead have needs that must be taken care of. To his surprise, about 40 close relatives and around 100 friends and acquaintances arrived. arrive, but he was still disappointed. He counted about 20 people who didn't show up at all. He was very upset, but now he knows exactly whom he won't be congratulating on their birthdays anymore. When a person comes to a funeral, they are usually 100% sure of who is being buried. In most cases, relatives and friends arrive early to say goodbye to the deceased while the coffin is still open. However, in the case of Gilberto Araujo from Brazil, everything went off track from the very beginning. When the message arrived that the man had been killed during a robbery at the office where he worked, it was Gilberto's brother who came to identify the body. He confirmed the identity of his relative. The official documents were completed, and preparations for the funeral began, with many relatives and friends arriving. And then Gilberto Araujo came home safe and unharmed, very surprised to see the commotion centered around himself. But how could something like this happen? Gilberto worked at a car wash, and a murder had indeed occurred there. The victim was another employee who looked so much like Gilberto that his own brother could not tell the difference, and the brothers communicated closely and regularly. It is hard to believe that someone could confuse their own brother with a stranger while looking at him from 1 meter away, but such things happen. Nikifores Glycos was a priest on the island of Lesbos in Greece. One day after the service, parishioners found him with his eyes closed and showing no signs of life. According to the traditions of the Greek Orthodox Church, the priest's body was placed on display for some time so that everyone could say goodbye to the Holy Father. But after 2 nights in the church, something strange happened. Nikifores suddenly sat up on his resting place and asked what was going on. It turned out he was completely fine. The venerable elder had simply decided to finally sleep a little longer. However, medical professionals were not so sure. After checking Glycos's vital signs, they concluded that the man had indeed been dead for some time. Considering that this miraculous resurrection happened in an active church, many parishioners believed that a genuine miracle had occurred. The family of Mohammed Furkan was grieving and preparing for his funeral. Everything was ready when the man lying in the morgue suddenly moved. Mohammed was only 20 years old. He had been in a car accident and several doctors confirmed his death, so the relatives had no reason to doubt the tragic news. But why did this happen? Furkan's relatives believed that the doctors deliberately gave them false information because the family had run out of money to pay hospital bills. The shocking incident led to a large-scale investigation of the healthcare system, and Furkan's family demanded compensation for emotional distress. In 2019, at the funeral of Irish Army veteran Shay Bradley, family and friends gathered to say their last goodbyes. Suddenly, a knocking sound came from inside the coffin and a voice said, "Let me out! Where the hell am I?" The mood changed instantly. People started smiling and laughing. This story is different because Shay didn't wake up at his funeral. He knew he was dying and recorded this message ahead of time to make everyone smile on a sad day.